partnered with the Digital Public Library of America and supported by Pivotal Ventures. Again, I'm Micaiah with the Engage 2020 team here at Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. Our team has connected with so many local organizations and even more community members to help get and keep our community engaged this year. Engage 2020 is celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, highlighting Black women's contributions to civic and social engagement during and since the suffrage movement, starting conversations about the history of voting and voting rights, and we are encouraging people to stand up and use their voice. It is clear that so many women of all ages, ethnicities, and socioeconomic backgrounds who are not or may never be a part of mainstream thought when it comes to women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment, and women's rights. Many minorities weren't granted citizenship until after 1920. Local and federal laws and certain organizations have made it difficult for minority groups to vote, earn a living, access housing and healthcare due to racism, sexism, xenophobia, and discrimination due to sexual preferences. It is my personal opinion that the less prominent figures of the women's suffrage movement and women's history in general need to be recognized and honored because they are just as critical to the women's rights movements as the household names we've all come to know. So we are very fortunate to have two incredible women with us this evening. Jinna Kim is one of Charlotte Business Journal's 40 Under 40, and Dr. Min Jiang is a professor here in Charlotte at UNCC. I am going to let Jinna and Min give you a brief summary about who they are, what they do, who they're connected to here in Charlotte, and then I will tell you about how our program is going to run tonight. So Jinna?
Sure. My name is Jinna Kim. I'm super excited to participate in Engage 2020. And if you hear background noises, I don't have a pet or kids, but I can hear some loud munching from my husband upstairs because I do live in a loft, which is like such a quarantine thing. So I'm happy to share. In terms of my background, it's kind of like by day, I'm a banker by day, but at night, I'm an artist. So this is actually my second career. So I have a BA from the University of Illinois. I have an MBA from the University of Virginia. But my first career was in arts administration in New York City. I worked at the Museum of Modern Art for 5 years. I started at the Public Theater. And then when I moved to Charlotte, I was able to participate in the best of both worlds. And I really like having that dichotomy. And so today I call myself an interdisciplinary artist, but I also do love my day corporate job. So it is possible to do both. And I'll pass it to Min.
Thank you, Jinna. Hi, my name is Min Jiang. I'm a professor of communication studies at UNC Charlotte. I teach media technology and global media topics at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. My research explores mostly the intersections of Chinese technology, politics, and policy. Incidentally, I had also worked on a Hollywood film, Kill Bill, before, and have come to appreciate really the tremendous effort that goes into the making of every film. As a Chinese American myself, I'm really honored to join today's conversation about a leading Chinese American women suffragist, Dr. Mabel Lee.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for being here. Thank you for sharing your time and your talents. So we are going to watch a film by Jinna Kim. Her film, Chinese Girl Wants Vote, was selected by the School of Good Citizenship and the Levine Museum as a part of their Counting Up What's on Your Ballot exhibit. The exhibit is on the Levine's website, so please check that out. It highlights the history of voting rights in North Carolina and asks what voting means to the 17 artists who were selected for the exhibit. There are some beautiful and powerful pieces in that exhibit, but Jinna is one of only 2 artists whose films were selected for the exhibit. And after we watch the short film, Jinna is going to share some information with us related to her film, and then we'll get to know Jinna and Min a little bit better. So here is Chinese Girl Wants a Vote.
She most certainly suffered unjust rejection galore. I don't know her at all. She seems really fascinating and I'd like to know more.
Who was the face behind Chinese Girl Wants Vote? From the National Park Service. Dr. Mabel Lee was born in China and lived from 1896 to 1966. After immigrating to the United States, when she was just 16 years old, Mabel Lee was a known figure in New York's suffrage movement. When New York City suffragists held a parade in 1912 to advocate for women's voting rights, Mabel Lee on horseback helped lead the parade from its start. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women throughout the U.S. the right to vote, but Chinese women like Mabel Lee could not vote until 1943. This was because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a federal law that was in place before she was born. The Chinese Exclusion Act limited Chinese immigration and prevented them from becoming citizens. Here are some of Mabel's words from her writings, China Submerged Half, and the Meaning of Women's Suffrage.
I plead for a wider sphere of usefulness for the long-submerged women of China. I ask for our girls to open the door to the treasury of knowledge, the same opportunities for physical development as boys, and the same rights of participation in all human activities of which they are individually capable.
The neglect and indifference to a woman's welfare in the past must be remedied. Prejudice must be removed and a healthy public sentiment created to support the progressive movement. To us girls especially, who are among the first to emerge, we follow the duties of pioneers, and, if we do our share, ours will be the honor and the glory. For no nation can ever make real and lasting progress in civilization unless its women are following close to its men, if not actually abreast with them.
It's a fact that no matter where we go, we cannot escape hearing about women's suffrage. The idea of women's suffrage at first stood for something abnormal, strange, and extraordinary, and so has finally become the word for anything ridiculous. The idea that women should ever wish to have or be anything more than their primitive mothers appears at first thought to be indeed tragic enough to be comic. But if we sit down and really think it over, throwing aside all sentimentalism, we find that it is nothing more than a wider application of our ideas of justice and equality.
We all believe in the idea of democracy. Women's suffrage is the application of democracy to women.
The fundamental principle of democracy is equality of opportunity.
I cannot too strongly impress the importance of suffrage for the requirement of women to contribute their share to the steady progress of our country towards prosperity and national greatness.
After graduating from Barnard College, Mabel Lee got a PhD in economics at Columbia University. She was the first Chinese woman to do so. After her father died in 1924, she took over his role as director of the First Chinese Baptist Church of New York City. She later founded a Chinese community center offering vocational and English classes, a health clinic, and a kindergarten. Dr. Mabel Lee never married and devoted her life to the Chinese American community in the United States.
The fundamental principle of democracy is equality of opportunity. I cannot too strongly impress the importance of suffrage for the requirement of women to be worthy citizens and contribute their share to the steady progress of our country towards prosperity and national greatness.
All right, Jinna is going to take us through a couple of slides.
Sure. So this is just a quick screenshots of the different actors that you can see in the film. And what I thought was important was being able to hear Dr. Mabel Lee's words universally read. So does it change the meaning for you to see, someone who's Hispanic or Black? The words are truly universal. And even though you can't see Min's face, she did the voiceover in the last iteration of the script. So moving on to the next slide, I'm just going to point out a few things per slide. So this is, I'm not sure if you caught this in the very first slide in the intro, but what I wanted to point out about this CNN digital piece. So what's interesting is I really feel like this has been a collaborative village, and how to use social media for good. So I started following, I never thought of myself as one who was particularly that interested in US history, but I became more so, and I became more of an activist, more to come on that later. And so someone had actually posted this story through a site I started following. So I started following North Carolina, the Centennial, just on Facebook, League of Women Voters, AAUW, various sites. And so this article I actually found through Facebook. And after I read it and I saw they had not only mentioned Mabel Lee, so I did some, I'm going to be very honest and candid, but I did some very quick scrolling and I was like, oh, look, there's a picture of Mabel Lee, and it's the same picture because a lot of my sources, they're all free domain. It's like Library of Congress. And I was like, oh, that same photo of my film, it's like in that. And so I looked at it, and it was nice to have part of it dedicated to Dr. Mabel Lee, who's lesser known. And so I actually emailed the author, Colleen Jenkins, and there's a quote in that first slide. And I'm actually going to read it because it's something that I thought. And another thing to note is, I know you just saw the film, but it's less than 5 minutes long. She must have watched it extremely quickly. It's very portable because I want to say in like within an hour, definitely within the same day, she had emailed me back with what a stunning video about the life of Dr. Mabel Lee, who was referenced in the CNN digital piece. Please keep the voice of Dr. Lee alive. And who is the author? She's actually the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the historical suffragists. And not to put more meaning behind of it, but you know, it was also significant coming from someone from a different race. So I'm going to move on from this slide to the next slide. So Dr. Mabel Lee lived in the past, and so not that many people may be familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Because she was Chinese American, I am pointing out these particular facts because she fought for American women's right to vote, even when she was a teenager, even though she herself faced discrimination, not just personal discrimination, but discrimination by the laws that were in place at the time. So, for example, we're talking about celebrating the centennial of women's right to vote, but she herself had a different timeline because she was Chinese. The repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act actually occurred in 1943. I'm actually Korean American, and there's other mentions. People have different timelines. And even today, we still talk about voter suppression. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is also significant, which was also the year of the Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1965. And that's not too far away. And we're still talking about kind of, you know, funky things going on with voting and things changing, not just because it's an election year, but also because it's during a pandemic. You can move on to the next slide. Oh, okay. So let's reserve that slide for later. So I'm going to pass it back to Micaiah.
Yeah, so thanks for that information. I don't remember learning about the Immigration Act. I might have, but it's definitely something that reemerged when I was doing research about the 19th Amendment. And it's just super fascinating that the Immigration Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, affirmative action, all of that stuff happened so close together and so tied together. You know, thinking about some of the misconceptions about affirmative action and like, you know, how some people say, oh, well, you're just filling a quota with affirmative action. Well, that's not quite true, but I wonder if that misconception stems from the real live quotas that happened with the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So all of that stuff is really very closely tied together and incredibly fascinating. I also wanted to acknowledge the National Park Service. You mentioned that in your film, and I was not aware until I was doing some research prior to this that they have a fantastic archive on their website. I mean, just beautiful and just so well done. I mean, they are preserving our land, but they are also preserving the history of the people and the culture that happened on that land. So if you have not checked out their website, please do so. So we're going to get into some questions. We're going to start with you, Jinna. How did you get into film as a medium, and why did you decide to use film to tell this story?
Sure. I do want to follow up on the National Park Service. Yeah. Sure. I mean, my narration came from the National Park Service.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you think about, especially now, like what's popular, you know, I know we talk about quotas for people, but you're like, okay, it's especially, so even though when I say local, you know, in North Carolina, if it's like a great day on a Saturday, you have to check social media. They're like, okay, park is at capacity. But like, you know, I completely agree. And these are all resources that are free. And a lot of this I honestly just found through Googling. Now with film, so I became an accident. So I do have an arts background. I was trained in classical music. I worked at a modern art museum. I worked at the public theater. Now film is interesting because it literally melds all of those disciplines together because you have visuals, you have actors, you have editing, you know, you have a script. And I did have a music background. And so it was kind of interesting. I didn't intend it that way, but I became an accidental filmmaker. I did the casting, I directed it, I produced it, I wrote the script. Minimal knows. I think this is like what you're watching is probably the 25th draft. And even though it's part of the Levine Museum, I'm proud to say that it's also part of the North Carolina Digital Heritage Library so that folks are able to download it for free and you can use it for whatever purpose for free use. Because literally I sourced the material, I had a lot of volunteers, and through the community here, especially through acting, I was able to say through acting, but basically through all the people I'd gotten to know through the arts, I had just put my feelers out there. And so most of the folks, including men, were volunteers in my film.
Okay. So why did you decide to talk about Dr. Mabel Lee versus just talking about why you think voting is important or what voting means to you?
So this is a very personal story, and it's a kind of funny one. So I actually didn't pick Dr. Mabel Lee, nor was I planning on participating in the women's, you know, suffrage movement or celebrating the centennial. And a lot of this, you know, we talk about American history. It's like, how much do you retain? Or is it that we didn't retain it because it was never taught? So there was a Facebook post, and this is all true, a Facebook post from a North Carolina theater that said, hey, I need an Asian American actress and writer to provide the Asian American perspective within a larger piece, highlighting stories of different real historical women to celebrate as part of the centennial. So they had already picked Dr. Mabel Lee, and then I researched her, I pulled her writings, and I did a compilation. What actually happened was I was replaced by my Chinese understudy, and this is the original script. And so they had replaced me after we copyrighted it, and they had published my photo, put my name out in their newsletter. It's like, this is like really happening, and it actually didn't really happen. So a lot of this wouldn't have happened had I not, you know, pursued this as a film. But even before that, it's not that I had a bunch of misgivings. I was, you know, of course I stewed about it. I did pass along for anonymous peer review through the Dramatists Guild. Even though I'm not part of a Dramatists Guild, I also saw that on Facebook. Y'all, you can use social media, you know. And I was like, okay, let me see if it's worth pursuing. And a playwright, and I don't know if Makai heard the story, but she left her contact info on the front page, even though it's supposed to be anonymous. You're not supposed to put it down. I looked her up. She was an African-American female. And she said, this is good to go. The Mabel Lee part's good to go. And I trusted her because she was a playwright and she wasn't Asian. So I was like, so after that, I was like, let me just see if I can get enough volunteers to make this thing happen. So that's like the real story of like, I wasn't like, yeah, I'm going to celebrate women's, this is like before the quarantine. I wasn't like, I'm going to become a filmmaker. No, it was really like a series of events that became more fortunate as time moved on.
Okay. Very nice. So, Min, how are you connected to the film?
I guess the simple answer is that I got involved because Jinna is a good friend, right? When your friend asks you to pitch in for a project like this, you typically say yes, which is what I did. So I did some voiceover work for it. And the documentary film for me is actually also a personal one. I grew up in China, never had a chance to vote because China doesn't have national elections. It was only last year also that I became a US citizen after living and working here in the United States for 16 years.
Wow.
So the first thing that I did after I passed through my citizenship ceremony was, of course, as everyone else actually at the site did, to register to vote. So I feel that I have a deep personal connection to the film. Also, I think at a more sort of conceptual level, I really believe in the project itself, right? The idea that voting is a basic political right in this country, and that we should not, take it for granted. That women, including Asian American women, organized and fought for this right over half a century, should not be forgotten. And also the very idea that people like Chinese American women like Dr. Mabel Lee were part of this movement should be something that needs to be remembered as well. So I think for all these reasons, the documentary film, I thought, did a really interesting job actually bringing all these elements of politics, race and gender into conversation, right? And of course, I cannot turn down Jinna's offer. And the only choice is to really be part of it.
A lot of people turn me down. So Min, thank you.
We're good friends for sure.
Yeah. Cool. So Jinna, what are your thoughts on art as activism, and what does being an activist mean to you?
Sure. So I know activism tends to be like a charged word, but I do want to finish that trail of thought. It's weird because, you learn a lot about yourself and, we talk about personal connections, but you also learn about your connections to other people because it's, people I didn't know would ghost me, or people would ask what I thought was strange questions, or some people just flat out turn me down. And it did, just regardless of, gender, race, because I would take it all personally and I would sit there and I'd psychoanalyze them. Like, is it because, I got one answer from an Asian. She's just like, I'm just lazy. I'm like, she wanted to kind of, and I judged, and now I'm like, who am I to judge, right? So in terms of, what I think of activism is a little bit different. So I just think of it as participation. An act of doing something is enough if it's authentic to you. Now it's because especially as Asian American, I don't go around work like I'm fighting for social justice, or I'm an activist. I don't think of myself as I'm an activist. I think, okay, I did something about it. Did I do it right? No, I did not do it right away. We're talking like months, many drafts, behind the scenes. Do you like it? I talked to Min for like more than an hour. She's like, yeah, that works. And I'm like, I don't know, so it can be behind the scenes. And to me, that is powerful because you're asking the question, you're having the dialogue, doing something like registering to vote. That's the first step. Congratulations. Like that is the first step. Voting, that's a powerful act. The other thing I want to say is you have to using your street smarts. If people want to try to take it away from you or steal it or make money off of it, it's got to be valuable. So regardless of what is it your right to vote, maybe they don't want you to learn how to read. You have to just think the other way. Like, why are you taking this away? Or why are you replacing me? Because it's still worth, that whatever I wasn't part of was still produced. So, but I guess my message is everyone can participate. Things can live in harmony. You can have theater side by side by film. It doesn't matter. There could be 100 stories of Mabel Lee, but I still feel like mine is unique. I'm not going to say it's better, but I still feel like that is authentic to my vision of how it came out. So again, whether it's voting, whether it's participating in the census, whether it's getting really pissed and then writing a parody, which is, or making an inspirational film. The last thing I want to say about this question is the film wasn't as positive and inspirational as I envisioned it originally.
Okay.
Got feedback from, my Chinese best friend and from business school. And she was very critical. She was like, you don't have enough Asian people. It's not authentic, and I wanted to interject it with critical questions, like her voice, read by, she's like, you can't use my name or my voice. And I was like, I don't understand. This is educational. Why would, but you have to imagine like literally I was like, what? You're my friend. I can't use your name or your voice or your, and you can't take it personally. So, but I would just say reaction is an act as well, but doing nothing about it is not an act. So just
very true.
However it manifests itself.
Yeah. Well, representation is definitely a big issue among minorities. We want to see ourselves represented. But for me, seeing your film and seeing those different faces kind of meant that, it's not just Chinese or Chinese American people who need to know about Dr. Mabel. Everyone needs to know about Dr. Mabel. So I thought it was really nice that you had different ethnic groups talking about her work and her voice and just reiterating some of the things that she thought was important. Everyone needs to be aware of the contributions that she made. So I thought it was really cool that you had some different faces in there. Men, what do you think about Dr. Mabel Lee's representation in this film as a Chinese figure in American history and as a Chinese American suffragist?
Sure. I think Dr. Mabel Lee's story is such a powerful testimonial of Chinese American and Asian American women's participation in the women's suffrage movement that stretched all the way from the latter half of the 19th century, right, to early 20th century. Traditionally, women and minorities are often expected to be seen, but not to be heard. But she was a very extraordinary figure, as we learned from the film itself, right? Including the fact that she was the first Chinese American woman to earn a doctoral degree in economics in America. And so unlike other white women suffragists, minority women, I would argue, face sort of double discrimination, right? Gender discrimination plus racial discrimination. We also learned from the film that even after women's suffrage became law in 1920, it took another almost quarter century for Chinese Americans, Chinese women like Mabel Lee to be able to vote because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so I think the documentary film is not only about Dr. Mabel Lee's personal story, but also about the collective experience of Chinese Americans in this country as well.
Okay. So would you say that stories like Dr. Mabel Lee's are critical to what we know about women's suffrage in America or the foundation of this country? How do you think she impacts what we know or the narratives we like to tell about the foundation of our country and the women's suffrage movement?
Sure. Stories like Dr. Mabel Lee's allow us to connect with our own heritage, our own history, our own past in a very unique way. Although white women suffragists like, Susan B. Anthony are well known, not many people, including myself, before this, documentary film, have ever heard about Dr. Mabel Lee, although she was a pivotal figure in the women's suffrage movement at the time. So the discovery and recovery of her story really allows her and other Asian American women to be recognized for their contributions to the women's suffrage movement in history. Also, as the title of this conversation series, Engage 2020, Look Back, Move Forward, suggests, there are important lessons to be learned from our past. Asian Americans, like their European counterparts, came to America from every part of Asia imaginable, China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, and the list goes on, right? People came here because they want to flee poverty, war, political persecution. Some of them came here to better their own lives and, seek opportunities. So Asian Americans, like every other ethnic group that came to the country, are part of this country's foundation. For instance, a lot of, I think this is a well-recognized fact that Asian Americans, especially Chinese Americans, were a major source of labor that constructed the transcontinental railroad, right, stretching from coast to coast to realize America's so-called manifest destiny as a continental country. And yet, I think there's also no secret that our society has struggled to accept Asian Americans as its own, right? Historically, Asian Americans, especially I think in many cases, Chinese Americans were absent from mainstream media. And as a result, absent from the national consciousness of their existence and experiences, and so varied, right? They're lumped together often as Asian Americans, but it's so hard, for anybody to unpack the complexity that make Asian American history. So I think it's important for Asian Americans to tell their own stories, because otherwise we tend to be portrayed as invariably very alien, very exotic, and sometimes very weak, meek, and even sometimes downright threatening to the American identity, right? And that is something we don't want to see. We have seen a lot of achievements of Asian Americans in our society, from arts, science, even lately politics. We have politicians like Stephen True, right, who was I think in Obama's administration was the energy secretary, right? And we recently have the first Asian American presidential candidate, Andrew Yang. So I think increasingly we're seeing more and more Asian American faces in our society, and that is a good thing. But at the same time, I feel like it's important to also go beyond the stereotypical model Asian minority story, because we also need other narratives about Asian Americans. It's true that we love, films like Crazy Rich Asians, and we love sort of Asian American superheroes, but it's also important to tell really more complex stories about Asian Americans, as we have seen with, movies like The Big Sick, and even the TV series that is very popular now called Rami, right? And that really try to help us to come to understand and appreciate each other better.
That was great. Thank you so much. So I think one of the first questions I had for you guys after watching this film and thinking about Asian American experience right here, right now, we are in a pandemic. We are already in a very monumental year, right? We're celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage movement, when the first women got the right to vote. It's a presidential election year. We've had all these local elections. We're taking the census, hopefully. There's a lot at stake, and we're being asked to stand up and care for ourselves and other people. And there's a lot, unfortunately, always going on. We're seeing these ICE detainment camps here in America. In China with the Uyghurs, we're seeing that kind of information come out, and women, the effects of women being in those camps have been in the news, and it's just heartbreaking and sad. And I'm just wondering what you guys are feeling, thinking of being here in this pandemic. Some of our elected officials have decided to call COVID-19, the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. How do you guys feel about the anti-Asian sentiment that has come from this pandemic? It's always existed. It's always been here, but it's kind of resurged since COVID-19 has kind of shaken up our lives.
So it's interesting. So I'll start. So I Googled, I'm like, what is xenophobia? And the other thing it made me think of was just well, technically, and I said this to my manager, I'm like, technically, isn't everyone an immigrant in the United States? How come certain people feel well, I'm in power, or I deserve my individual opinion. Whereas if you're a person of color, sometimes they're like, oh, you're representing all people who will look like you. You know, like, it doesn't matter that I'm Korean, that means Chinese, or Makaya, that you're African American. You're just a person. You know, you can chunk it in different ways, right? You can say you guys are all people of color, or you're, you know, segmented. However, so in terms of anti-Asian sentiment, you know, I've been blissfully ignorant. You know, even the app, like growing up in American schools. So I immigrated when I was 3, and I'm also a naturalized citizen. So I was just like, okay, American history is going to teach American history, but American history just isn't white and black. It's like, it's, you know, but there's only so many hours in the day, right? So like, can you imagine? We're like, you know, there's only so many facts you can keep. But what I can say that is, you know, this is real, you know, because I remember I had asked, and I don't want to pit like different circumstances. Like, no, it's different. Obviously, Black Lives Matter is different from anti-Asian sentiment, and it's different from whatever perspective you're in. But the House passed a resolution as recently as last week, right, on September 17th, denouncing racism towards Asians during coronavirus, and that's House Resolution 908. So it is, I would say, people feel it in different, may feel it either more localized or more targeted. The way that I experience it is, I don't know if it's a double bind, like Min said. Is it, you know, because I'm female and I'm a person of color, where you have either these microaggressions or what I call, I just started using microaggression, so that's my new buzzword, but I'm like, I was like, is it genteel racism or is it microaggression? Is it bigotry? or am I just being petty? You know, you can't keep blaming others. Maybe it's just you and you're not the bigger person, you know? So you have to think about it. But, you know, we are blessed, right? If you're not getting tailed by a cop, like, what's your reaction? It's different depending what you look like, what time of day it is, you know, those kind of things. Or, you know, being an immigrant now versus what if I came from a different country that had a different quota or was less favorable? You know, like, you can't pick where you're born. You just were born wherever you're born. So, you know, it is more complex, as Min suggests. But as it relates to anti-Asian sentiment, I do feel people experience it differently, because there are so many Asian countries that I don't think any of us can name them all from memorization.
I agree that the anti-Asian sentiment is real, and it has historical roots and connections. I think we can reasonably say that whenever the United States has difficult entanglements in Asia, Asian Americans tend to suffer at home. If you recall, during World War II, for instance, after the US declared war on Japan, hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps. After 9/11, all Muslim Asian Americans automatically became suspects in this country, although they had nothing to do with what happened at the World Trade Center. So you tend to notice this pattern that America's conflicts in Asia invariably somehow lead to American society to question the loyalty of their own fellow Asian American citizens. As a group, Asian Americans are somehow seen as less trustworthy, less American than your European counterparts, right? You never see, for example, Irish Americans or Italian Americans somehow getting questioned on their loyalty because, you know, American run into trouble in or conflicts into in Ireland or Italy, right? Yet this happens again and again to Asian Americans throughout history. And so when President Trump used the term the China virus or Wuhan virus, instead of just using the neutral term COVID-19, many would believe that he was intentionally stoking racial hostility towards minorities, and especially Asian, especially Chinese Americans. As a result, many Asian Americans, not just Chinese Americans, but Chinese-looking Asian Americans became the target of verbal and physical, including physical assaults My nephew, for instance, who was in Boston at the beginning of the pandemic, was afraid to go to grocery store because he was afraid to be singled out and attacked physically. So that's the extent of the influence of our public figures on the psyche and on the actions of our citizens. It's really heartbreaking to see Asian Americans being assaulted in this country for something that they have nothing to do with in the first place. And so I think the rational thing to do is really to separate Chinese Americans from the Chinese, but also to separate Chinese government from Chinese people. These are completely different categories. Confusing these categories really, I believe, moves our country backward, not forward. And so it's important to, I think, voice our concerns, objections when these, occurrences do happen. And so we need to make ourselves heard.
Thank you. So Jinna, are you making anything else art-wise? Are you going to continue using your voice for women and voting for a while, or you started working on your next project?
I have. So segueing from what Min was saying in your question is, I've recently been fortunate to do a PSA for wearing masks. And you may see me locally here in Charlotte kind of, this may sound weird, but like, people, I've been told, by casting directors, like I look extremely generic, which is a good thing for me. But like, if you see a familiar face, like it's on the Charlotte's Got a Lot website or TV commercials, I don't know how many I've done. Like to me, just representing a positive Asian face, especially now, because now, like, for example, I got to do a PSA before the pandemic about how to recycle pizza box, 10 seconds. And basically it's like, if it has food stuff in it, it's waste. Always recycle right, for a pizza box, because it sounds so obvious. Maybe what we're saying sounds so obvious, but it's not, because people still aren't doing it. Maybe it's intentional, maybe it's not. And so those are ways that, I can participate through the arts, not just as an actor, but also, I had some negative feelings that manifested through arts and comedy, actually, because these are difficult topics, right? Some of them are historic. Maybe young people think it's boring, or maybe it's just too much information. Maybe it's misinformation. Maybe people are pissed about it, right? So what I did is I made a parody, a parodic film about myself. And it's more of a gender bending. So instead of about anti-Asians, anti-avian. So it is kind of, it's not a stereotype, but I did kind of think about the Chinese zodiac behind the scenes as well. So if you want to show the next slide, I can talk a little bit more about it. So this is a piece. Various snippets have been out. I am still trying to produce the full-length version. Would be like a 10-minute either Zoom play or a film. But right now there's 5-6 minute versions and even short clips that have been out. But here you can see, instead of birds or instead of Asians, we have avians, and that is me playing a rooster. And I do realize like rooster's male, but you can see I get replaced by, other birds, and we're all Asians, but can't you tell we look different? And maybe we're a different race. And also it's a very, for a difficult topic, it's easier to embrace because you can look at a cartoon, for example, or an animal. Like, what does the dragon represent? What is a puppy dog? And also you can elevate it with music, make it sound even more funny or more dramatic. So that's another way that I really, not just as a coping mechanism, but a way that I can share my story to a different kind of audience, which is, I realize, pretty different from the documentary, but you can have fun with it. Every conversation doesn't have to be angry or serious. There's a reason why, people gravitate toward binge watching things, or they have to go on vacation. You have to find a way to not just be yourself, but find your way to participate in whatever's going on.
Agreed. Awesome. So do you have any thoughts? I mean, your film was a part of a exhibit about voting. Do you want to share with us any thoughts, tidbits about voting?
Sure. So let me talk a little bit more about where my films are going to go. And I do have some fun facts that I have gotten from, actually I got this from work, but one thing that I do want to share is there is a lot of, it's not just people's opinions, but there's a lot of misinformation. And I really found, not just through this talk, but the library to be a safe haven, not just for my film, because, you know, there'll be a place for it that people can reference in the future, but really look at the sources of information and where you're going, because things are changing. So whether you're looking at a legitimate source, you're hearing in the news, you know, laws can change, places can close. So just, you know, always spot check that. I am excited to say that my films will continue as both the documentary and the parody in different film festivals. It'll be part of the Silicon Valley Pacific Film Festival starting next weekend, where they're highlighting, I think they have like over 70 films from Asian Americans. And that'll be exciting because, again, I'm being honest, like I don't think, oh, I'm going to spend a week to watch. First of all, I'm like, how do I even curate like 70 Asian films, and where would they be coming from? And, you know, like with my attention span, you know, it's not like watching I'm Korean again, a Korean drama where I'm just like, I'm going to dedicate 2 weeks, eat Korean food, eat ramen, and just watch, you know, like some love story, you know, it's so I'm excited about that opportunity. In terms of voting, what's interesting is I learned this from Democracy North Carolina, which is nonpartisan. And I actually learned more about this organization through work, which was referenced again in School of Good Citizenship, in terms of, you know, finding information. But if you look at real numbers and statistics, so it's true. In North Carolina, Asians are a smaller percentage. So what I thought was interesting is, okay, between the 2018 and 2014 election, there's 25% more white voters cast ballots in 2018 versus 2014. But we're talking in the millions, 2.7 versus 2.2 million, rounding up. Then you look at black voters, you're like, okay, increased by 20%. Oh, that's pretty good. But instead of millions, you're talking about like 750,000 in 2018 versus, you know, 629,000. Now, when you look at Hispanic and Asians, Hispanics, it's like, oh, cool, more than double the number. Okay, but it's like 41,000. You know, like million. Like, you just count the number of digits, and then, you know, Hispanics, you're like, oh, look, 250% more. And then you actually look at the real number and you're like, okay, 26,000. And that's not saying anything, but like, these are still powerful because every vote counts, especially at the local level. Like Dimple Ajmira, I don't know if I'm saying her last name correctly. She was part of my Charlotte Business Journal's class of 2019. She's the youngest Asian American, like Charlotte councilwoman. And I emailed her. She actually emailed me back. I was pretty surprised. I don't know. I was and I wasn't. I was like, hey, she helped, you know, connect me with this. I was like, you know, because other people were like part of Engage 2020 and they'd seen my film, and I thought maybe they'd add me to their panel, and they didn't. So I was like, maybe I'll do my own panel. And I was like, let me read, you know. So, and she's younger than I am, and she could dance. So I say this because, you know, I feel it too. Like once my husband's like, oh, let's watch this documentary after work. I'm like, no. I cannot watch another. I already work on it. You know, this is me. So yeah, sometimes I'm dramatic at home. I try to like hide it, but like, you know, I don't hide it, but you know, you have to, there has to be, there's many different things you could do. But again, just double check your facts. just like before you go to the store, make sure it's open. Min, anything else you'd like to add?
I love Jinna for your animated narrations and storytelling, and as a person in general. And you brought this film together, and thank you for organizing this for us. I know that we have spent probably, you know, a short, a few hours on this project. You have spent hundreds of hours on this short film. So we really appreciate you for what you do. I would say Asian Americans are Americans. Our voices, like everyone else's, really matter. Really, please vote in 2020.
Yeah, so this takes us, and I'll ask Micaiah if there's anything else she'd like to point out. But another thing about my film, oh yeah, so it's like, I'm like, oh, look, I'm making PowerPoint slides for work. Oh, look, I'm making PowerPoint slides for fun. Filmmaking, you're like, people don't realize I'm always like, this is my serious side. I'm like, shh. You know, you have the sound, you have the editing, and it takes forever because even a 5-minute film, I mean, there's so many different aspects of it versus like, you know, I thought classical music, spending, you know, 10,000 hours to be like an amateur professional violinist and violist was impressive. And then I got to acting. I'm like, at least I don't have to sing in another language. I don't have to, you know, play sheet music. And then I got to filmmaking. I was like, oh, wow. Because you got to learn, you know, there's equipment, you know, that's costly. You got to edit it. Anyway, so I digress. What I want to say about my film is, you know, when you saw the earlier slide with all those different people saying the same words and how universal it is. So what's interesting is so what I did today, so I learned what I really want to encourage people, especially young people, especially people from the library, if you watch this now or you watch this later, you don't necessarily, especially the best time is now, because this is a true quarantine film. Although I got a HUG grant, it was only $250, and that's like the cost of my film. It wasn't, you know, I heard people like, someone was like, oh, it was 105,000, or, oh, well, I want this grant. And I'm like, where does your money go? I obviously do not feed my actors. You know, like literally, I'm like, that's, you know, like I use a tripod as recently as this morning when I don't have time, because right now this light, the reason why you can see me is not a real tripod, but my backup tripod is a garbage can. And I just put like a GPS suction cup and I just stick my phone on there. This is a used iPhone. So like, and the reason why I say now is there's a lot you can YouTube in terms of editing. You know, when people play, some of the music was composed in like less than an hour. So what I wanted to say about looking at these particular faces, so I did see on Facebook, someone was going to run a film festival for kids. So I was like, oh, let me do another cut of my film. So I probably have maybe a half dozen variations of this particular film. You're like, how is that even possible? Well, for the kids version, I just picked the top row. I just put youthful voices. And because all of them recorded more lines than I needed. And so I did a version where it's all Asian voices or just generation. So, you know, there are things that you can do to continue. And there, I mean, it's just, I guess my main message here is you don't know until you try it. Because I wasn't like kicked and pushed into becoming a filmmaker, but if I didn't do it, I knew that my work wouldn't manifest anywhere. Like it would just like, you know, when they talk about like that script that never got produced.
Yeah.
Or the novel you never wrote, or the actress you never became, like, this is your moment, you know, even if it's a TikTok video, like dance or whatever. I'm like, I'll watch it, I'll try it. And it doesn't have to be public. You can do it in private. I mean, there's, you guys don't see, you know, what Min said, you don't see the hundreds of hours of not failure, but you know, like you got to inch your way through, right? So at the beginning, like I had to hire an editor because I don't know how to edit. And like, what did I do today? I edited a cut of my own film on iMovie.
This is really a labor of love, as you can tell from Jinna, but also a lot of us who participate in the film, we are complete volunteers, right? We're doing it because we love, you know, the concept, the project itself, and what it represents. And so for us, time, effort really is what we could put into this film. So we're really happy to see it.
Yeah, it's a great film. And I thank you guys so much for having this conversation with me tonight. I wanted to give the viewers a couple pieces of information. There is a recently opened Asian American Center at Chapel Hill. It's part of UNC, and they seem to be having some great programming. Another Engage 2020 team member forwarded this information to me, and I thought it was really important, a really important conversation that they're having as a part of this newly opened center. The first one is tomorrow night. It's called Affirmative Action Isn't Jim Crow, and you can sign up for that at that website at the bottom, aac.unc.edu. And then they have one in October about Asian Americans and the vote. If you do not know, the census is changing. They keep changing the date on it. But if you have not taken that, please do so. It's really important to make sure that you and your family are counted. And the election is coming up. If you plan on voting in person on November 3rd, I think, or if you're planning on doing an absentee ballot, you need to make sure that you're registered. You have until October 9th to register. The next program that Engage 2020 is having is an art and activism series. It starts this Thursday. That is this upcoming Thursday. It's called Art and Activism again, and we present Rosalia Torres Weiner this Thursday at 6:30. So please check in for that. If you need more information, of course, you can go to our website and visit our catalog. And if you would like to see what Engage 2020 is up to, we have a website at cmlibrary.org/Engage 2020. That site will give you some information about our grants and what we're trying to do this year. And then there's a link to take you to our website where we've got some great archives, some information from the various team members who've worked so hard on this. There's some information about COVID and how that's affected people. And again, if you need to register to vote or check your registration, you can do that through our website. Thank you guys so much for participating. Again, I really appreciate your time and your talent and your education and your inspiration. I think a lot of people will, we've learned so much about Dr. Mabel Lee and the effect that she had on the women's suffrage movement and the history of Asians in this country, Asian American relations. And I just appreciate talking to you. And I hope that you all will go check out Jinna's film and some of the other artists who talk about what voting means to them at the Levine. And I think that is available through November 8th. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Cool.
Yeah, the Light Factory will have an exhibit thereafter that's also in partnership with the School of Good Citizenship. Mm-hmm. So you'll see some community members, a lot of this was happening over Zoom. So it is possible. I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily take you 6 years. I mean, I just think about, wow, the past 6 months, mm-hmm. and my films are going to have a life thereafter. And some of these things, like if you're messing with your phone or playing video games, you could totally make your own. Mm-hmm. You have friends who mess around with music, ask them to help or do a voiceover. Thank you, Min, again. Or reach out to a librarian about, where can I look up resources or where can you watch other films? There's a lot of things available for free as well.
Absolutely. In the library, we offer so many books and videos and equipment. We have a podcasting kit. We have a video recording kit. So you can check that out in our catalog. And like Jinna said, this is the perfect time to kind of capture your thoughts and feelings. We've got so much going on this year. You are absolutely going to be a part of history. Our family we're going to be ancestors of people who look back at 2020 and see all the craziness that happened this year.
Okay, so I'm going to close with a library story.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I didn't know how to make a film poster, and I reached out to people in graphic design. And because of the quarantine at the beginning, the library said you can hold on to your books and DVDs. Yes, I still check out DVDs from the library.
Yeah,
and I don't have DVD, right? So I had like DVDs and audiobooks for like months. And so early one morning, because like I saw other people design my film poster, and I didn't really like what they did. So I'm like looking at home and I'm like, oh, and I had DVDs, and that's literally like how I got inspired. I was like, okay, these are audiobook covers, these are DVD covers. And then I like Googled it. I was like, okay, there's like skinny font. So like I really appreciate the library. You've always been behind the scenes. You're literally in my house right now in terms of, not just through this programming. So I just want to thank you. Like you help people in other ways that you don't realize, because like literally that's how I got, and I can't tell you the movie. So it's kind of weird, but like Schindler's List and Joker were how I designed my film poster. Just very
awesome.
Yeah, the topic is totally different, but graphically, like a simple poster, skinny font, like black and white, just saying.
I'd also like to thank Micaiah for doing a fantastic job organizing this, and also Sabrina working behind the scene, hours spent on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Quickly. There are 4 library sites that will be hosting early voting starting October 15th here at Mountain Island, Allegra, Westbrook Regional, formerly known as Betty's Ford Road, and West Boulevard. So if you are interested in voting early, you can do same-day registration. Please visit one of those sites. Have a great night, y'all.
Vote. Bye-bye.
Bye.